We can speak on any number of issues within the sustainability spectrum, but some topics are more obvious than others. If you've listened to the show before, or if you've met me, you've likely noticed how often I address sustainability in a rather philosophical or abstract sense. You'll recall in episode 1, titled Stories, for example, where we met with Tyler C. and discussed the importance of speaking to and learning about where our community members come from and what makes them tick. But to understand and effectively expand the definition of a sustainable mindset, practical discussions have to happen as well. Some discussions we've already had, such as clothing with Bree Krodinger on episode 2, and hair care with Courtney Jackson on episode 6. These specialties and the industries they highlight provide us with the feeling that we can make a larger impact in our societies than we realize. After all, if our world is to become cleaner and our communities truly more conscious, we have to start making small changes where we can, rather than a few of us doing everything right. Now, we speak about communities all the time on this show, so it's about time we focus on the most sacred of our spaces, our homes. Coeur d'Alene is growing faster and faster, and housing is always in high demand here. There is much debate within our city on how to most appropriately handle that situation, and the arguments tend to fly in any number of directions. My friend Brad Thrasher is here to help us sort through this housing subject. Besides having a ton of knowledge on housing and having a rad name, he's been working on an incredible project called Core Village, something I'll let him tell you about in just a bit. So to get right to it, and to avoid any further ramblings, let's get started with episode 9 on the Sustainable Culture Podcast, Sustainable Housing. So I'm sitting here with Mr. Brad Thrasher from a company called Coeur Holdings. I really admire Coeur Holdings. If you're not aware of Coeur Holdings, I encourage you to check it out. They're doing some pretty cool stuff in secrecy these days, sort of, and you guys have done a lot of really cool things that I've really admired. But Brad is the project manager, and he's an operations guy for the Core Village project, which is something that is really awesome. We're going to talk a little bit about today. So Brad, tell us a little bit about what you do, what the Core Village project is.
Certainly, and thanks for having me on here. I really appreciate that.
Welcome to the Sustainable Culture Podcast.
Thank you. So the Core Village project started a few years back as a vision. Tom McNabb, a while back, he bought some land. He bought 35 acres out on the prairie. We bought it for water rights, actually, which is kind of funny. He to the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer.
Yeah.
Really good water we have here locally. So he bought it for that, and then he looks up, a year later and says, "Okay, I have this land. What do I do with it?" And so he starts talking with me. This is around the time the Innovation Den and downtown Coeur d'Alene opened up, so we all got connected that way. That's how I met you.
Yeah.
And how a lot of this stuff, how a lot of things started, actually. And so started talking about this vision, and Tom was aware that throughout the world, globally, and also within the United States, that these sustainable villages were becoming more and more popular. And these environments, they've been around a long time. I mean, the sustainable aspect has become more important, obviously, in our modern time, but these very community-focused villages, or multi-use, mixed-use rather, communities have been around for centuries.
They take different shapes and forms.
Very much so, yeah. Lots of different versions that you can see, but broadly speaking, they've been around for a long time. And in our particular area here, and they've also been very popular for a long time. I mean, you go back to, you go to Rome, for example, which, I mean, that's just a place that I've been, so I can use it as an example from personal experience, but you go and you're in the square, and you have the residents that live up top and the businesses on the bottom, and the kind of the community gathering places as well, intermixed with that. Beautiful buildings, often some green space spotting thing, and all of that. Like, who wouldn't like that? And the humanity's been doing that forever.
Yeah.
But we don't really have that here in North Idaho. This is one
No,
of those
we got a lot of
places on
developments.
Earth. It's an amazing place to live, and I will never leave. It's incredible. But that mixed use, really, the community center in downtown Coeur d'Alene has that a little bit, but and Riverstone tried to be that. Riverstone and Coeur d'Alene, it's a mixed use development. They tried to be that, but we don't really truly have a concentrated community like that.
Right.
And that's what we want to create, basically.
And I've seen different things. There's a lot of you're right. There's a lot of attempts in Coeur d'Alene of that. Like you even see that with some of the community gardens, because there's different community gardens you see in the area. There's different people I've noticed that have tried to like link up the community in different ways.
True.
Like, and it's interesting about the Riverstone development because I think you're right in that. Like it is close. Like once you get into Riverstone, if you're unfamiliar with Riverstone and you don't live in Coeur d'Alene, Riverstone is a big. It used to not be there at all. There used to be nothing there.
It used to be a mill, a sawmill, and
right.
I think
it's this area of land where I guess an old mill where they ended up building. It started with the theater, and restaurants all built around it, and it's this little walkable area. Once you get in there, it's pretty cool that I like the fact that it's walkable.
I do too.
They
that
tried
initial
some
core
things.
area that they started with, where they started with the theater and really built around the theater as a hub, which was a good idea. It worked, but as that they built out away from that, it changed, and much of the core, that original center area, so much of it is dedicated to parking. That it really it kills it because there's no place to really hang out or have or for community to gather. It's dedicated to cars, and obviously yes, we have to put the cars somewhere. But the way that it was designed, ultimately, its downfall in terms of the fact that it's not what it necessarily set out to be. It's a successful development, and it's awesome. It's beautiful. I love it. I like going there. But it is definitely lacking. They designed themselves out of that possibility, basically.
Yeah, it kind of feels
really
exclusive.
Vibrant community.
Right.
That's a great public gathering place. It feels like it's made for the few residents that actually live there, and as just a slightly more beautiful, normal commercial center, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's well
versus
put.
Something really special.
Yeah, you go there and it does feel like its own little club, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, no, you're right though. It's got an interesting vibe to it. They tried with that, but you're saying that the way that like a village project that we've seen really throughout history, these are communities where, would you say that like houses are built similarly, and what constitutes a village in terms of your core village project?
Well, in terms of us, our primary the two pillars that I would say in our project are community and sustainability. Community, honestly, is the most important thing because you can make something as sustainable and as environmentally friendly and as you want, but if it fails to cultivate community, and in that sense, and that's a broad term, of course, but we all really know what it means. A sense of togetherness, a sense of you really want this to be your third place that you spend all of your time. We have our homes, we have our places of work, and then there's that third place. And where is that? Where do you want that to be? And funny enough, I think I won't tangent too hard here, but
it's okay. I love tangents.
Starbucks kind of pioneered that third place in America, at least. Yeah. That third place where people wanted to go and just spend time, and it was whether they were by themselves or they were with friends, or maybe where they might run into a friend. It was almost like a living room away from home, if that makes sense, in the way they set the places up. Yeah. And at least their original places, they were very cozy. They had the leather chairs and the fireplaces, and over in the Seattle area where I grew up actually over there, so I've been into a lot of their older locations, and they were all like that. And that was massively successful. It created that sense of community and comfort, pleasantness from a design decor perspective, and that third place basically.
Yeah, I think a lot of the most successful places, now that you're bringing up Starbucks, like even like coffee shops in general, Coeur d'Alene Coffee, places that have, couches, like nice, like not just seating, but like areas in which you can relax. Like here at Coeur d'Alene Coffee, for example, in the Innovation Den where we're at right now, you got the fireplace and you got the couches, and people can meet up and just chill.
Right.
Or they can sit there and have a conversation, or they can sit there and work on whatever they're working on. Yeah, it is like a living room. I hadn't thought of it that way.
And it's funny because a lot of you don't, and I definitely was in this position where you don't actually realize that, but there's certain types of places that you're just drawn to naturally, and you keep going back to, and you don't necessarily think about why that is. And if you stop and think about it, you figure that out. But there's this subconscious, these reasons why we're drawn to certain spaces, and that's a very repeatable, from a design perspective, is a repeatable thing. It's not random. There are ways to, it's not necessarily a math equation. There are X factors, of course, in there too, and the nuances that we were discussing earlier, that for sure. But it is, if done right, it's repeatable. You don't just accidentally do it. I mean, you can, but usually not. If we accidentally or just, normally we end up with something that's, uninspired and stale. So normally you have to, really have the intention of doing that from the get-go. But so in Coeur d'Alene Coffee Co. and the Den at large did a very good job with that. And which is why it's so popular.
The more welcoming the atmosphere when you walk in, the more you want to hang out. And there's so much evidence of that. So it's
absolutely, and that environment will contribute to that. If it's a pleasant, beautiful, inspired environment, that will affect the psyche and your mood and all of these things, which you can then transfer to the people around you and the people that are coming in, and that creates the vibe, and all of these things affect each other. Everything matters, in the end.
You bet.
So starting with the on the baseline, creating that awesome environment is kind of the canvas, basically, on which everything else kind of comes out of, is a huge deal.
Yeah.
It really.
So around a village project, for example, you're saying that atmosphere, that sort of overall welcoming vibe is at least attempted to be included within a whole village, not just a place like a coffee shop.
Yes.
But in a grander, sort of more grand of a scale.
The indoors and the outdoors is the idea to and that's a tall order to pull that off and instill that into every aspect of a large development, which is one of the reasons why we're taking our time. We want to be sure that it's done right. You can't undo, especially in the development world, you can't undo things.
Yeah, you can't just scooch your couch
right,
over.
Yeah, like I'm going to move this building over here, or I'm going to, let's redo this. It doesn't really work that way. Right. So from the the concept and the vision phase, it's been quite clear, but executing and taking a vision to this is how it pencils out. A vision and even the end product can be amazing, but everything in between that, the money and making the financials make sense and execuing,
part of the process,
it all has to work. The end result is not enough. So,
and we'll talk a bit about the financial aspect in a bit. First, I want to kind of start with, now that we've kind of introduced sort of what you're working on right now, I want to kind of start with some of the basic stuff. So when we talk about sustainable housing, I mean, what exactly are we talking about? How is a sustainable house different from your run-of-the-mill American home?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of technically definitions of what a quote-unquote sustainable home is. It can take many forms. You could have a highly energy efficient home with LED lighting and Energy Star, this and that and all of that, and you could technically call that a sustainable home insofar as that it's energy efficient and that it has less emissions than your quote unquote ultimately from your current house. But when you really get into it, the at least in an ideal world, it's not just energy efficiency, but there's so much that goes into it, and you can get into the total embodied carbon of a given building, which meaning that for the building that was built, you look at everything that went into building that building, all of the trucks, all of the materials,
from start
all of
to finish,
everything, and what's the total implication as far as the emissions, and I guess using the carbon aspect is an easy way to distill all of that if it comes back down to that, but it's really more than that in the end, but ultimately, yeah, sustainable, the further down that path you go, the more sustainable a home is, and so
kind of depends on how deep you want to get.
Very much so. Again, it's you can go shallow, which is basically energy efficiency, and you can go really, really deep as well.
Right.
I mean, deep even to the point where you're well beyond environmental implications, and you're purely focused on human well-being, basically, and such as the environment and how that environment makes you feel, the quality of the air. How harmonious is it with the outdoors and with nature, and how seamless is it from going from the inside to the outside, and does the design language reflect the design language of nature, and all kinds of things that you can get. It's a deep rabbit hole, a really cool one for sure, and the deeper that you go, the more, I would say, essential some of those things become, but all of it is there's a point to all of it, though.
Yeah, I've even seen those houses that are shaped in such a way to blend into their surroundings.
Right, like the Hobbit house sort of a thing.
Yeah, that kind of thing. I've seen anything from...
Those are awesome.
Those are so amazing. I'm such a Lord of the Rings fan, too, so I see that kind of stuff, and I'm like,
I
want to live there like a Hobbit.
Sweet.
Yeah, and I see that stuff, and I get so inspired because... there's houses I've even seen that have, they're like a box, kind of, and they're just set up in such a way where the roofs are slanted just at the right angle to where if you're driving on the road and you looked out at the field in which the house sits, you really wouldn't even see the house unless you were looking for it.
Yeah.
And it's done intentionally that way, so you see the surroundings. I think that's amazing too.
Absolutely, and that's again another kind of an aspect that's deeper down the rabbit hole of how it impacts, even from just a psychological preference or perspective of beauty, and how that impacts nature or what you can perceive is that you can take it all the way to that where you just want the view to be maintained as you drive down that piece of road.
It's so important too.
Not have that imposed.
Yeah, and that's a deeper level of, I think, system. I mean, assuming they're doing all the development and stuff and all that stuff. I mean,
it is definitely deeper.
Yeah,
but relevant. I mean, these things, they impact our quality of life in the end. I think we take a lot of those things for granted, but things they add up.
You bet. In terms of developing, well, what are some things about the way we develop? I mean, prior to building a home, that is unsustainable. Speaking of, as of now, we're comparing to sort of your run-of-the-mill to the sustainable way.
Right.
What are some key differences there?
I think a lot of it is contextual. So depending on the environment that you are developing in, but an easy example is, say, developing an environment where there's actual wildlife implication. There's many ways to go about that. You can go and you can clear cut a piece of land and uproot everything and create that clean slate, or you can try to minimize your impact and leave as many natural features as possible, leave slopes, leave some boulders, leave some trees or whatnot, and design around it and let that contribute to the natural beauty in the final product. It takes more thought to do that. Not always more money, actually, but certainly more thought. You can't take cookie cutter apartment complex and just plop it down in an environment where you're designing around the natural features where it might impact, again, wildlife or anything else that's already there.
I imagine let's say, for example, uneven ground. A lot of people I know a lot of developers will flatten out a whole area. You kind of touched on clear cutting.
Typically.
Yeah, and I know I've seen a lot of sustainable houses really try to work around that and build the houses around that. It takes more time, but it can be done.
It does take more time. It takes more time and more, and again, more creativity, more thought. It's usually a deal where
innovation
it requires design and innovation. Yeah, right. Yeah, God forbid. Yeah, we have to innovate and not just have the same cookie cutter. Well, this is the process and this is the design.
Right. This is how we build houses. Period.
Exactly. And so I would say that there's functional aspects that we need to be, but I mean, it really comes down to a mindset, which we've seen before. There's more to all of this than just mindset, but that's definitely part of the issue. Is this is just how it's done. Getting rid of that mindset from the get-go of this is just how we do things is probably actually, now I'm just thinking of this now, one of the most important things.
You bet. I mean, I talk about mindset all the time. I sound like a broken record sometimes, I feel like, but when you're talking about doing anything sustainable, housing, we talked about coffee shops, starting up a coffee shop, doing a clothing business, talking to someone, getting involved in maybe even a tense conversation and trying to learn about someone that you're going to disagree with. Like, all of this stuff starts with your mindset prior to even going into it. And I
100%, you're right.
Yeah, when you get into this stuff, it's just everything. And so I feel like when it sounds like what you're saying is when you're going to develop sustainably in terms of housing, there's a process that goes on prior to the development in the first place. Prior to even the planning, you have to make that decision. Okay, we're going to do this in a sustainable way,
right? And we have to consider that the entire way through. You do. It's very true. It's very easy. You can get off track and veer back into the easy route very quickly, very easily.
Yeah, I bet.
Because inevitably, when you are working on any development project, there's so many different parties that are involved. There's the city, there's dozens of subcontractors and the architect and the engineers, and there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And any one of those guys right, exactly, is typically if you don't have a really tight rein on it and you don't really keep focus on what you're trying to accomplish with the vision, it just naturally always goes back to the maximum efficiency and, well, this is what we know, this is what we've done before, and all of that.
Yeah.
So
it is interesting how we always sink back in to those methods, and I think it's an honest thing. I mean, I really do. I mean, when it's
human nature, really.
For sure. I mean, it works.
We do that with really everything when you think about it.
Right. Yeah, we like to do things the easy way.
That's what humans do.
You bet. I think it was Steve Jobs that has a quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, "Lazy people make the best engineers." Because they're able to find the efficiencies in inefficient methods, and I love that quote because I think it just touches on human nature, like you mentioned. It's easy to fall back into those basic patterns because it works, the price. There's less surprises, I should say, and this and that. Innovation is harder. It's a lot harder, but I think it's more exciting, and especially with sustainability.
More exciting. It's more rewarding. There's so many things. There's so many reasons. There's a million reasons to pursue the path of greater resistance, but with greater reward. And again, that can be applied to. I mean, I guess these principles that are ultimately become issues with sustainable development can be applied to almost everything.
You bet.
From just how we get out of bed in the morning and just from from A to Z. So
it all goes back to that mindset.
Exactly.
From the very get-go. You're absolutely right.
Exactly. But as far as to come back to the question of what can be done prior to or on the early stages of development, and as a more concrete example of if you have something, and say you have a hill or something, you were mentioning that homes that how they're built oriented to hills or into hills and all of that.
Yeah.
And the orientation of a particular piece of land. For example, southern exposure, is just how you decide to orient the whole project can have massive implications on that. So you can easily use the terrain to your advantage, not just because it seems like the right thing to do, or it is maybe a better way to do it, but you can actually utilize those features, the natural features, to your advantage. Ultimately, they'll have long-term implications as well, that are very functional and that help it pencil out, over time with energy consumption or just a higher value.
Not to mention, it makes it much more unique. I think those houses, people really...
Well, at this point, it's very true. It makes it stands out.
You bet.
Yeah.
So speaking of, there are many different styles of what's considered a sustainable home, like we mentioned.
Right.
Like, designers have really taken this idea and innovated some really incredible buildings. One of these kinds of standards, there's many, like you mentioned, that you've had experience with, is called LEED certified. If you haven't heard of this, it is an acronym, LEED. It stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. I studied this a little bit in some of my sustainability courses in college.
Right.
Really fascinating stuff. Can you tell us a bit about that, and how do LEED certified buildings tend to separate themselves from other buildings?
Yeah, LEED is a great program. They're probably the most well known as far as the I guess you could call it a design standard, essentially. Certification that you can get, and there's several out there, others that are similar to LEED, but again, LEED is probably one of the oldest and one of the most developed at this point methods.
Yeah, they're gaining popularity.
Standards, very much so. Even here in Coeur d'Alene in the North Idaho area, there's a number of LEED certified buildings, which you wouldn't know that they were if you didn't actually look. But online, I think it's on. I don't know if it's on LEED's site or not, but you can go and you can actually look at.
It is. I went on there and checked.
Database.
Yeah.
And the first one that I noted that was here was, funny enough, it was a Starbucks, but I was surprised that building was it's LEED certified, the one in Ironwood by the hospital.
Really?
Yeah.
See, I didn't even know that.
And you wouldn't even know going in, but there's a lot of elements to that, and again, first and foremost, it's the goal of LEED, of course. They set out the design standards that make it easier it kind of removes the mystery of what do I need to do to get X product, X quality of building or X level of sustainability, and there's different levels of LEED you can achieve, and gold and platinum, and all of that. But it's interesting because the standards themselves are excellent and essential. Really, it gives a pathway and how to achieve again, a certain product. Early on, and I think that they've more or less addressed this issue, or they're continuing to work on addressing this issue, is that early on, and this was a hole I think that they didn't identify that they did after the fact, and the whole thing was that they have these standards and you can get certified as a LEED building, but basically how it worked was that you draw up all the plans, so you bring basically the final designs of this is what we are building, this is what we're approved for, and all of that through the city and everything. And the LEED certification was based on the designs and not necessarily the final product. So there could be deviation between approval of plans and getting all of that finalized to doors are open and people are using the building and all of that.
Right.
And so for a while, people were kind of turning their nose up a little bit, like, well, what's the, this is kind of a, I don't know, what's the point, sort of a thing. Like,
what's the pragmatic result
like you can say
here,
the same thing with the USDA certification of, well, it has organic for food, well, it has that, but there's all these things in the middle, that could go this way or that way, and it's not a guaranteed indicator of quality.
Right.
So, and they've done a lot of work to address that, and at this point in time, it's a pretty tight system where inspections are being done post build and all of that, and you don't get your certification unless it passed certain tests and all of that. And so there's a lot that goes into that, and they evaluate many things from the envelope tightness, air quality, obviously materials that are being used, and energy efficiency, most of which is highly measurable, measurable stuff. But yeah, I think LEED is awesome. There's a few others out there that are really good. WELL, WELL, is another really good standard. They're highly focused on indoor environmental quality, basically, so air quality and kind of a well-being, sort of how it affects your physical and mental health.
So very ethically oriented.
Inside of a space.
Yeah,
very much so. Another interesting one is Passive House, or Passive Haus, technically, HAUS. It's originated, and the standard originated in Europe. And the U.S. has its own version of that here now. And that whole thing is, and I bring this up because I think it's just interesting, the different types of standards that are out there. So Passive House is distinct from LEED and WELL, in that their primary focus is envelope tightness, which leads to certain levels of air quality, but most importantly, certain levels of thermal efficiency. So because Passive House, to be certified Passive House, you basically, at the end of construction, they do what's called a blow test. They have specialized equipment that will they force air through all different parts of the house, and they can measure if there's any leaks anywhere. So during the construction process, if a random guy put a nail hole somewhere and didn't cover it up, and it was just a pointless nail hole that just shouldn't be there, but I don't know, stuff happens, it'll fail the blow test because there's a gap, and the blow test will catch that, and that's a thermal inefficiency. It's a thermal bridge, basically.
That is fast. I've never heard of Passive House.
Their main focus is basically maximum thermal efficiency, and then you have something like LEED and WELL that are a bit more broad. They're more broad, and they cover a lot of different things. So I think that there's more than one way to achieve something that is, again, quote unquote sustainable, but different standards have different focuses.
Do any of these vary in terms of, just curious, do any of these vary in terms of, because obviously there's primarily focused around the building, but are they focused at all on the external design at all, like maybe just like the property area?
Yes, as far as, so not the exterior of the home, but of the immediate surrounds, basically the grounds.
Yeah, like I've seen different, for example, there's different LEED buildings, going back to LEED, where I've seen, like when I lived in Portland, Oregon, there's a couple of, they advertise that they're LEED certified, and they really try and boast that LEED program.
Right.
With their building, and there's a couple that...
So it can be hard to achieve that.
It can, yeah. And I see a lot of really interesting external, like, for example, design of the grounds. Rather than it just being grass, for example, they'll do these big, really cool gardens and stuff. I mean, is that directly related to LEED, or is that something that's more just a cool accompaniment?
From what I'm aware of, and there could be some updates that have changed at this point, but to my knowledge, it's not based on the immediate, the surroundings. It's focused on the building. Now, there are sustainable development implications that I think will factor in as far as you qualifying or not. But as far as ultimately, you can qualify for LEED without having a beautiful park or like just green space, lush thing immediately around it. And again, like the Starbucks building is a great case in point. Everything around it's concrete. It's a parking lot.
Right.
so that's not necessarily the focus of most of these standards. There is a standard though, and I would say that from what I know of, probably the most stringent and thorough, crazy, awesome standard that I know of is called the Living Building Challenge, which is kind of a funny name for a standard.
The Living Building Challenge.
And they have different, they call them petals, like a flower petal of the different things you need to achieve. But basically, in short, they're all about, well, I guess the best word is everything. They get into everything from the inside of the building to the external design language of the building, how that flows and how it's harmonious physically and visually with the surrounding, the natural surrounding environment. Everything that is measurable and that is psychologically and physically and mission-wise and sustainability, all of that, everything that is related is accounted for basically, and it's pretty insane actually. So if you can find some of the most amazing and unique buildings that have been built through that standard to achieve that standard. I'd actually highly, if you haven't heard of it, Living Building Challenge, highly recommend looking them up. If for no other reason, just to marvel at what it is. It is, unfortunately, I can't imagine how you could ever make something like that pencil out from just a conventional financial perspective. Usually things built to that degree are passion projects or by people who are well-heeled and want to see something happen, or that are heavily subsidized by the government or other things like that.
We'll have to look into some of that on the break. That is really, really cool.
Yeah, neat stuff.
Living Building Challenge. I'm going to have to look that up for sure.
But they get, and they're one of the few that I'm aware of, at least, that get into what you do with the environment, the exterior. It matters, and they do factor that in. They're all about what's called biophilic design is what they call it. So it's basically it's the idea is to connect nature and the building and the people together, basically.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's the kind of stuff I get so jazzed.
That's the stuff of dreams. If we could make everything that way, there'd be so much beauty in the world that I think we wouldn't have any problems. But
yeah, seriously. Well, that's what we're talking about. That's definitely that's the dream. A lot of people critique having utopian dreams. I say phooey to that. I love utopian dreams, because how are we? They always, the old saying, aim for the stars and you'll hit somewhere.
Right. Well, absolutely. You need to have an ideal, a standard that you're shooting for.
You bet.
So if you can't quite get there, then so be it. But I think overshooting is always a good plan as far as I'm concerned.
Oh yeah, I'm all about that.
Yeah.
So let's take a quick break. We're gonna take some time, take a quick breather, maybe stretch a little if you're listening and want to do some chores or something. I don't know. But we'll be right back. We're going to talk a little bit more about sustainable housing. We're going to address some of the potential downfalls to it, perhaps, if there are some. I think there might be some interesting feedback there, and see where we can go from that. So we'll be right back. Thanks again for listening to the show, folks. Just so you know, you can now make a donation to support the show whenever and wherever you want. Go to patreon.com/sustainableculturepodcast to do so. You can make it a one-time thing, or if you want to be really awesome, you can schedule it as a monthly payment. Any support helps push this show up to the next level. Thanks again for listening. Now let's get back to the show. So welcome back to the Sustainable Culture Podcast. We are here with Mr. Brad Thrasher of Coeur Holdings. We've been talking a bit about sustainable housing and different facets of that, and we're going to get back into this, and we're going to address a couple new topics. And one of the first things I'd like to bring up here, Brad, is types of building materials. We talk a lot about like development. We've already addressed development. We've already addressed different sets of innovation that is required to talk about sustainable housing, but what kind of building materials do you think we need to switch away from, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Tough to answer that because if we switch away from something, we need to replace it with something. So that's the tough question. Things that we would do well to use less of, I think would be maybe a way to answer it. I would say concrete and steel are the two things that come to mind first, because they have a significant carbon footprint. They're very heavy. Also, steel it's finite. Concrete as well. It's funny you think of concrete as they use sand and water and other things that seem like they're very abundant, but a great case in point for the problem with concrete is China has, they're massive. They're building like crazy, growing like crazy over there. And they're using so much concrete for their infrastructure, roads, dams, all kinds of stuff, bridges, using so much of it that they are having trouble actually finding the sand that they need within their own country, which is massive.
Yeah.
To make enough concrete for their needs. They're importing a lot of that stuff now. So it goes to show that even something like that is not, it's not infinite. So that said, the question is...
That's incredible, by the way.
What do you replace it? It is. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, running out of sand. We don't have enough sand.
Right. Yeah, it's like it's something
that is a hard thing for me to imagine.
We take for granted, probably, or probably most people take for granted.
Right.
But yeah, when you get to a certain level of volume and development, it's almost. I mean, I guess in that regard, if you get to a certain level, then all things are unsustainable, and at some point, I mean, you just. But at the same time, it's so how do you maximize the sustainability? And one of the things that has, I think, really a ton of promise is, have you heard of mass timber before?
Mass timber?
Or cross-laminated timber, CLT wood.
I have heard of cross-laminated.
CLT. So a lot of really, really great promise with that. So basically mass timber is a broader term for different types of alternative wood products, and CLT is one of the more common mass timber products, and stands for cross-laminated timber. And so basically, what it is it's a you could imagine just a beam, a wood beam, and traditionally to create that wood beam, that needs to be carved out of a trunk, a single trunk. Basically, typically, if it's to have a certain load-bearing ability and structural integrity and all of that.
Right.
With CLT, mass timber products, they can take other components that would normally be multiple types of or pieces of wood that would normally not be usable and would basically be scrap, and they can combine them to create, in this case, a comparable or superior beam of wood. So instead of having to blow through an entire tree for, say, a beam, they can take scraps of this and that and all of that and combine it to get the same thing. So it greatly reduces essentially. So firstly, it reduces waste significantly from the prospect of wood. And wood, I guess, to back up a little bit, wood is obviously highly sustainable because we can grow it.
Right. There's a right and wrong way to do it.
We can actually control that fairly reasonably, versus we can't control the amount of steel and sand, really, and there's other things that are available within the earth. And they can also be harvested much stronger. So to put it in perspective, wood, if you look at a building that does not use any steel and it's wood structure only, wood's amazing, but the load-bearing abilities, the strength that wood has is obviously very limited compared to something like steel. Right. So you normally can build a building over, say, 5 or 6 stories, probably, typically, and that varies, for various reasons, but just call it 5 or 6 stories, roughly, of exclusively wood frame. Anything beyond that, and you have to get into steel, basically. With mass timber or CLT, that increases that, and this is just what the technology is capable of up to this point, can get up to about 18 stories. So you can basically, multiply the height capabilities by about 3.
Yeah.
All the while, avoiding steel. And there's other implications too, but that with wood versus steel, just to stay on that for a second, from a harvesting perspective and just the overall environmental impact, the weight of it and transporting it and all of that. I mean, wood, timber is superior in every way, shape, and form, hands down. The only problem with it is some of the inherent limitations with what you can build, what you can achieve. But CLT is addressing not to an infinite degree. I don't know if we're ever going to be at a time where we're building high rises out of all wood, but at the same time, the CLT capabilities are massively increasing the wood capabilities. It also makes it more fire resistant too, with how they put it together. So, which is another
that's
inherent
too.
strength of steel that wood would normally fall shorter on, but so another long term.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, speaking of that, what are some other? So we're talking about better materials to use. What are some other materials that you know of? I've heard of people making concrete out of hempcrete.
Yes.
Or bamboo flooring, bamboo stuff in general. Some folks even make their homes out of mud and other things of the earth. Anything in particular we should keep our eyes out for aside from different wood stuff?
Definitely. Well, bamboo, firstly, is awesome. I mean, you could almost call that just it's an offshoot of wood, basically, and it's incredible. It's very durable. I mean, it grows like a weed. It grows crazy fast.
I remember reading a study saying that in the right environmental areas, it can grow up to 3 feet a day. Bamboo shoots.
Really? I didn't even know that.
3 feet per day. It's like you could sit there and watch it grow.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, it's almost like watching the clock. Like, it's just like.
Well, and you mentioned China earlier. Speaking of bamboo, just a quick tangent here is they still use effectively today. They still use bamboo for their lattice work for when they're building buildings.
Yes. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's incredibly strong. It's amazing. The strength to weight ratio on that material is amazing. And the application, especially flooring. I think one of the reasons it's so popular for flooring is that it's a natural material, which is always more desirable than something that's synthetic. And everybody likes wood floors. Why wouldn't you? But it's very durable. And one of the things, so it works great for certain applications, but one of the things that can be kind of tough about bamboo, where it's narrow. I mean, just the stalks are fairly narrow. So there's lots of ways, kind of like the CLT, where there's things that can be done to increase the girth and therefore the different applications on that. But there are some things that, for example, you can build a wall out of wood or out of bamboo, or but it takes a lot of it to do that. So, but I would say that bamboo is awesome. Another thing to really, I think one of the coolest materials that has the most promise and intrigues me the most is hemp. And you mentioned hempcrete. Yeah, and that's one of the coolest products.
Seriously, I'm so fascinated with the idea of using hemp.
Yeah.
I mean, we hear about using hemp for all kinds of stuff. I used to have some hemp shoes.
Yeah.
There's people make clothes out of hemp fabric and stuff, and that's really cool. Yeah. There's all this cool stuff you can do, but the fact that you can make concrete out of it,
it's pretty amazing. So with hempcrete, it's a combination of hemp, limestone as well. It's a mixture basically of those two, or more than that, and water, of course, and other things. But it's creating concrete out, but in a completely different way. So hempcrete, in its current form, what we can achieve with it is amazing. It's not, I think, more widely used because, especially in the States, because of the stigma of hemp. I mean, the stigma of hemp has greatly inhibited the innovations.
What if my house catches on fire? Will I get stoned?
Yeah, right. And that's part of the funny thing about that is that hemp, in general, if it's processed right, and hempcrete in particular, is incredibly fire resistant. It doesn't really burn. It more as I'm not even sure it even smolders, to be honest. It's incredible for fire resistance. So, and if you compare it to wood, actually, it's vastly superior to that. And the interesting thing about hempcrete and other hemp products, and even just if you want to look at just pure hemp, even so, hempcrete is a mixture of materials. But there's some friends I have by the industry. I mean, call it the sustainable industry, where they have a sustainable focus on sustainable technology. Basically, they're working with a company that they're still early in the development, but at this point it's a proven technology, and they're just working on how to scale it, basically, and they're working with some of the big boys out there on how do we scale this and bring this to market. Yeah. But the product is pure hemp, so there's no limestone or anything else. It's pure hemp. And the way that they, if it's processed, we'll just call it, in a certain way, it can achieve a rigidity that it's almost like you can almost use carbon fiber versus steel as kind of a comparison here.
Oh,
it has an incredible rigidity and strength to weight ratio that is superior even to steel. And
so I imagine it's more lightweight too.
Much lighter weight, a fraction.
Oh my gosh.
A tenth of the weight, probably, somewhere thereabouts. And obviously much more sustainable. But it's 100% hemp. And the cool thing about that is that we're not having to draw, other things from the earth in the case of hempcrete, limestone, and all of that to make that creation. But the thing about hemp and most of the virtues of hempcrete come from the hemp specifically, needless to say. But the higher percentage of hemp you have in one of those products, the greater the benefit for sustainability, for the material being used, and for the other things it can do. And one of the really cool things about hempcrete, or we'll just say hemp in general, as a building material, is that it's many things. It can perform many functions by itself that would normally take several systems or materials in traditional building. So hempcrete and this other hemp product that I mentioned, that again it's in early phases, has load-bearing capabilities. So you don't have to, and traditionally hempcrete, early renditions of it did not have load-bearing capabilities, where you couldn't just build a building with just hempcrete walls. You had to reinforce it with some steel or some some kind of stick frame or something like that.
Oh, okay. So it is more sustainable, but only so much.
It needed the support of other materials. Now though, the way things are going, it's getting to a point where they are load bearing. So you can build a house, you can build walls, I think the application of roofs is probably, maybe the jury's out on that, but as far as walls go, it's getting to a point where they are load bearing. And not only are they load bearing, but the insulation level. So if you look at hemp, if you take a hemp wall that's a foot thick, and you compare that to conventional wall that has a foot of your typical insulation or fiberglass batting or something like that, the R value, the insulation value of hemp, depending on what you're comparing it to, but compared to your typical insulation, is greater. So basically the insulating value of hemp is incredible. You have a hempcrete wall. Typically R values, if I recall correctly, R values in that exceed about R40, and your typical wall with your typical insulation that's more affordably built is closer to about R16, and a higher, a slightly nicer and higher insulation wall is about R25-ish, thereabouts. And then you get into your passive house type of thing I mentioned earlier. Often walls of that stuff are approaching R40, maybe 50 or 60, and that's through the use of foam insulations that are quite expensive, very effective but expensive. But so basically hempcrete has incredible insulating capabilities, and that's not just to keep you warm. I mean, that's just temperature regulation all around. It slows heating and cooling, so it reduces cost and therefore emissions and all of that on both sides of the spectrum. So it has that. It also has this is what's completely unique to hemp. It has moisture absorbing attributes. So basically it helps regulate the moisture level inside the building. It helps, basically, it sounds kind of crazy, but it actually helps recycle the air, so to speak. It absorbs, because it absorbs CO2 and other things, and can basically help. So it's almost like a natural air filter, if that makes sense.
God,
so
that is amazing.
it can serve as your load bearing, your structure, your insulation. It's incredibly not noise resistant, but it creates a great noise,
like just insulating
buffer. For a more peaceful and kind of separated interior, if you like that. And basically the recycling of the air. So it's doing all of those things as one material, and it's also incredibly sustainable. So I think personally, from everything that I know, that the most exciting thing and the most promising material is hemp in building.
I would agree with you.
For the vast majority of structures, and how that applies to, say, something like a high rise. I mean, it is highly applicable. You can have a steel frame and then have all of the walls and all the fill and all of that be hemp, so it's entirely doable.
Man.
But it's really,
is it any
really
more
exciting.
expensive? Like, is any of this stuff more expensive than what's been considered standard?
Like, yeah, it is, and like but not so much that it's undoable. Hempcrete is actually not too. The problem with all of these things is the availability. I mean, so it's only so far into the market. Mm-hmm. The adoption is still pretty low. So the earlier something in the adoption cycle is, the more expensive it is. Hasn't scaled to a point where it's not commonly used, and also
right.
you need somebody working with hempcrete, for example, is a specific skill. It's not just, I'm going to get a concrete guy and have him do that. You have to know what you're doing mm-hmm. with that. So then, of course, there's a supply and demand of labor too.
Yeah.
So there are caveats for sure with
more
that.
Specialized
some limitations, yes, and that will change. I mean, and it's like with everything. I mean, you look at technology is a great example of when a 30 gig hard drive first came out. It was, I don't even know how many, probably hundreds of dollars, like it was unfathomable, and now you can get it for like mm-hmm. $7 or something like that. So
I remember little thumb drives,
yeah, right,
it's like, that's 1 gig, right. No way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. It was like, you just couldn't believe I can fit how many songs. And so it's the same thing here, and with how rapidly things are progressing. This is basically, these building materials are basically, they've gone into the technology realm. Like, yes, they're building materials, but a lot of these, the innovators of this stuff are basically the tech companies at this point, and in some shape or form often. So I think that we'll see the progression really pick up on that, and it'll
seriously. And I didn't even plan to talk about this today. This is probably a whole nother topic, but I'm even interested to see, because I've heard stuff about like 3D printed houses, stuff like that.
Yeah, there's guys out there that are doing that full on printing.
I know
houses, and
that's fascinating stuff too.
And there's many different. The 3D printing world is very, very interesting. A lot of promise with that.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see where that's going, and that someone thought to use it for housing.
Right. I mean, they're finding ways to apply it to virtually everything. I mean, it's pretty crazy. I mean, from cars to boats to, I mean, there's a company just here in Coeur d'Alene, Continuous Composites, and they're a really exciting company.
Yeah, I met a guy recently who works for them, one of the engineers there, and that's pretty exciting. That is a small little place, and if you guys haven't heard of Continuous Composites, just a little side note, please go check them out. Actually, they have a little, it's pretty small, little location here in Coeur d'Alene, but some of the stuff that they're pumping out of that place is really impressive.
Yeah, and a lot of it's not public info, and I'm not aware of everything they're doing, but what I do know is that a lot of the stuff they're doing, we can't know about yet, but it's going to shake things up, which is say.
They're innovating some brand new stuff.
They're talking with really, really big names. They're doing things that there's a lot of people in the 3D printing space, but what they have figured out with their unique
technology. They remind me a lot of some of the beginnings of Rohini, for example. Rohini kind of had something similar. They talked to a lot of big names. They're changing the entire industry.
They still are. They've actually at CES this year, they unveiled a new technology with a joint venture they have with BOE, biggest TV manufacturer in the world, based out of China. They have a joint venture with them, and they unveiled a technology that is basically I'm not the guy to I'm gonna stumble around and not eloquently explain this, but basically it's they're blowing the minds of the biggest names.
And LED string, that's nuts.
Paper thin stuff, and the density of the LEDs is 10 times or many times beyond that. The density and the capability of the next best thing.
I get so excited when tech stuff like that gets brought. So really the big point here is, like, when we're talking about housing, or even just to go more broad than that, sustainability in general, really paying attention to these little engineering, truly small engineering firms and what they're coming up with. It's those ideas and how well they're actually executed. I mean, they get picked up. If it's smart enough and it's oh my gosh, that stuff is really something to get excited about, because when you see a small tech company or a small engineering firm or a small design firm or a place like Coeur Holdings coming up with really cool village ideas, I mean, that type of stuff is the stuff of the future, truly. Like that's what gets me so excited about what you guys are doing, because I mean that's you know, you're getting a little peer into what's coming. And when I hear about all these new materials like hempcrete and stuff like that, I mean, it is so exciting to see what we're looking you know, moving forward here.
Absolutely, yeah. And seeing that this stuff is happening in Coeur d'Alene. We have
in 60,000
people. I mean, you know, we're just this like resort. I mean, everybody knows, Coeur d'Alene's beautiful and all of that, but nobody thinks of Coeur d'Alene and then they think of, you know, a technological innovation hub. And I mean, we can't call ourselves a hub yet, but as far as that goes, but we are. And it's the fact that can be done. It shows it can be done anywhere, you know, if you have the right vision and you know, the right goal, and you stay true to that, and you bring in the right, you know, in the case of these companies, I mean, obviously they find the right talent as well, but that stuff, that innovation can come out of anywhere, even the most unsuspecting places, and
you bet.
And that's, you know, why we have the aspiration to develop with the core village a place that's worthy of anybody's attention anywhere in the world. Just because we're in Coeur d'Alene doesn't mean that it can't be a place that, you know, is a standout nationally. Or
I mean, why not here? You know, it's
why not? Yeah, why not?
So speaking of all this stuff, I mean, we're talking about all these amazing things about sustainable housing. What are some of the downfalls, or perhaps some of the, I guess for lack of a better term, what are some of these humps we're trying to get over as far as sustainable housing? What are some of these challenges we're trying to overcome right now as it stands?
Cost.
Yeah.
It's really all it comes down to. There's no, in every way that I can measure it, there's no drawback other than cost.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. And if, you know, the world revolves around money in some form or fashion in the end, and that's just how it is. Resources, you know, it's how it works. But ultimately, that's really the only barrier. If it cost the same, then we wouldn't have to, you know, figure out what the value proposition of these things, of this is why we should be doing this and this is why we should be changing. I mean, change can be difficult, I suppose, if, like we were saying before, if you just do things in the way that you know how to do them and it's comfortable and all of that. So that even if cost wasn't an object, there would still be some battle to be had of, you know, we need to change our ways of doing things. But when you add the cost on top of that, and if you're building, say, to the LEED standard or the WELL standard or passive house or anything of that nature, you're typically looking at, I mean, 10% is a low side, and probably typically 20 to 40%, 20 to 30 is pretty common percent increase in cost, which in of itself isn't necessarily the end of the world, but where the issue can come in is if it costs you 30% more to build a building, is it worth 30% more when it's done?
Right.
Usually not. Usually there's a disparity there. So you're often looking at a 30% increase, say, in your build costs, and a 10 to 15% maybe increase in value. And so where does that extra margin go? So that's what's hardest.
Now that's interesting too.
For a lot of guys.
Oh, you bet.
Yeah.
I mean, I can certainly relate with that. I mean,
yeah.
Well, first, and we'll talk about this actually in just a moment as our last point, but I mean, that the cost thing, I mean, that's something that it definitely, in terms of my generation, that is something that is definitely plaguing millennials And Gen Xers, housing costs are really
Absolutely.
It's so hard to buy a house right now.
I mean, feel it too.
You bet. Yeah, it's
I
it's not impossible, but it's so much harder to buy a house now than it was, say, 50 years ago. I mean, there's so much data to support that, and we could go into that, but I don't even want to. But
it's kind of depressing.
It is, but that's interesting because it. I almost think of like how we value homes, like what we're actually ranking on. I'm wondering if those criteria could change, like what
they need to change.
They need to.
They do. You're right.
Yeah.
The traditional way that we value something is inadequate when we're looking at this type of development. It's not factoring in all these different types of categories, and especially when it comes to, say, your overall indoor environmental quality, as in the air quality and things, and what are the implications of a building that is built to the LEED standard or one of these other standards is going to be a better built, more solid structure just by nature. It just is. So there's definitely a short-term and a long-term value proposition to be had there of, yes, you save time, you save money over time with the increased thermal efficiency and energy efficiency, but you also have greater structural durability, and all of the unique components and materials within the home are often of higher quality and typically therefore of longer lifespan and durability. So with those, but that's where a lot of those nuances and those details are lost in translation when you're looking at the upfront cost versus the final product value. And a lot of it is also just very subjective. A lot of these buildings are that the value of them is sometimes in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I think that objectively, yes, they're worth more because of X, Y, and Z and better materials and standards and all of that. But there's also the factor of you'll have one person that says, oh, it's LEED. What is that? I don't care. And then you have another person who says, that's all I want. That's all I want to live in. Like, it's got to be this. And they will pay above and beyond maybe even what it costs over conventional to build. And so it depends on the consumer, really, the supply and demand aspect of that. And I think that is the prospects of that are improving as people become more aware of issues and more aware of this is this and that is that, and this is why this is better and this is why you might want that. When it comes to these higher qualities and more sustainably developed stuff, beyond just the philosophy and the ethics behind it, but also just wanting it for what it is because it's a better product.
Seems like to see like real tangible changes there. I mean, you would have to have an entire change within within the industry itself. I mean, the whole industry would have to kind of start to shift. We're seeing like little innovative groups change certain things, and like we talk about hempcrete and stuff like that, for example, and that's more cutting edge right now. But it seems like, which is amazing, and I'm super stoked about it. But at the same time, we would have to see an infrastructure change over the entire thing to really cause like real differences there in terms of, we haven't even really talked about affordability per se in this episode, and I wanted to hold that off because that's an entire conversation that I would like to have, but that's its own challenge altogether.
Right, it is. Very important topic.
But to see that kind of thing, to see true affordability, to see more people be able to really get involved in housing that is more sustainable in the long run. I mean, we would have to see the whole industry change.
True.
In terms of its standards.
It's adoption. It comes down to it's a culture shift that's not just in the development industry, but entire population. I mean, it's it's all relevant. Coming back to that, what people value and what they think certain things are worth, and supply and demand, and all of that. Until all of that starts to basically catch up, so to speak, and increase, then and it will, and it is happening, and at a reasonable rate, from what I can tell. But it is definitely. I mean, this is it's a massive. I mean, changing the culture is never. It's a slow, big thing. So
it has to be generally accepted.
Change the direction of something like that.
Right,
it takes time. So.
Segueing from that into, because we're talking about affordability, we're talking a little bit about people being able to buy homes. I mean, it is true that less and less people are buying homes these days.
Yeah, that's true.
Any millennial will tell you.
Yep.
Buy a home, they'll laugh. Though I have seen positive trends of more and more people buying tiny houses. I know tiny houses got real big for a minute, and then we stopped hearing about them.
Yeah, they did for, it was funny. They were huge for a minute.
And then we stopped hearing about it. They're still a thing, totally. But now we just don't hear about it as much. It's not as trendy.
Right, exactly.
But it takes relatively little money to accomplish things like that. And in your opinion, what sort of affordable ideas like this could people be pursuing to lower the carbon footprint that their home creates?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that piece of the picture up. So, yeah, we're definitely, again, going back to the culture, definitely trending away from what, like in the 80s and the 90s, it was getting really popular. Everybody wanted the most square footage they could possibly get, that they could possibly qualify for, pull off with their buying power.
This is my piano room. This is my thinking room.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the McMansion craze, that has plagued. I would say is an appropriate term for that. Plagued America for a few decades there. That was pretty prevalent for the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But I think that the recession, that 2007, 8, and that period of time, the recession, it was a big wake-up call in a lot of different regards, and then following on the heels of that, the greater awareness that we've with the environmental issues, the sustainability aspects, and the sustainability issues have been around for a while, but have come to a head obviously pretty recently.
Oh yeah.
And so when you combine those things, it's people of preferences. There's definitely been a culture shift. I think we're seeing a real people trending away, really trending hard away from bigger is better and more is more. They're looking for, what do I need, and quality over quantity is becoming more of a thing. And of course affordability becoming more and more of a problem, which that's a very complex issue, affordability. Obviously with from inflation to costs of everything, of labor, of goods, and all the things that go into
there's so many things you have to bring up
for everything. It very much so. It's massive, and I won't pretend I even really understand it well, but you can start touching on pieces of where all of that starts to come into play. And so but as far as the going towards the those trends of the smaller footprint and consequently the more sustainable nature of housing, we're seeing that with millennials probably more than anything. I mean, millennials are the kind of the green generation. Probably the most conscious generation thus far of these issues. But
I would even argue Gen Xers even more so.
For
not
sure.
Gen Xers, sorry, Gen Zers. I said Gen X earlier too. I think I meant Gen Z.
The Zoomers, as they're affectionately referred to. For sure, absolutely, they're cut from the same cloth in that regard. But even Gen Xers and Boomers are to some extent, maybe not all for the same reasons. They all have maybe slightly different motivating factors. But even the Boomers they're getting to a point in their lives where their kids are gone, and for the most part they're out of the house, and they are looking around like, what do I do with this 35 or 4,000 square foot house? It's just us two, or just me, or whatever, and I don't want to take care of this. I'm paying taxes on this, I'm cleaning this place, I'm upkeep, it's upkeep, it's all these things. And so we're seeing a trend towards downsizing across the board. And for millennials, a lot of it is affordability, but for boomers, it's often I don't need this.
Right.
I don't need.
It's just too much.
This much house or this much stuff.
Yeah.
So that bodes well for sure for the future and those shifting preferences. And it's ironic actually that affordability issues are, nobody likes that. Obviously, it's an unpleasant issue that we have to deal with. But
it's life.
But a silver lining of that is that it is resulting in a increasing demand for smaller and therefore more efficient and therefore more sustainable places of dwelling. So yeah, while that's not great, it's actually helping, I would just say, prod that that trend, in a more intensely, more quickly, in that way. Where and regardless of how you feel about it, multifamily housing, I mean, it's really helped, made that take off.
Actually, to pause on that, that's an interesting concept. Like, multi-family housing has been a thing in different other, like, European, Scandinavian countries have really been doing that kind of thing. Shared living. I forget exactly what they call it, but
communes maybe, or
it's this one building that has several different people, different families that live in there, and they have a shared eating area.
Very, very into that. Denmark, I think, I've seen
Denmark. I've seen Sweden. I have a couple of friends that actually live out there, and I don't know if probably Norway. I would imagine so, but yeah, they've utilized this thing, and of course situations like that aren't always ideal. But the idea that you have an option, and again, we're not getting into so much in this episode in terms of the idea of affordable housing as a term, but that's one thing that I'm glad to see. That's promising, knowing that other countries have made that work. It would be nice to see more of that in the U.S. We see it sometimes, but it would be cool.
Yeah, definitely less, I think, and again, that's a cultural difference that Northern Europeans have versus us, is that we definitely seem to, for better or for worse, however you want to look at that, value our privacy and our own personal space in a different way.
Oh yeah, we like to have our stuff
than they
here
do
in the U.S.
And that's understandable, but we can still have that though, and do that in a more sensible, less wasteful way, which I think is where these trends are going with and I think that you're mentioning the tiny homes, that will continue, and I think that the tiny home trend is, I mean, they're really tiny,
real
400 square foot,
yeah,
little deals, or sometimes smaller.
I think I saw the other day it was like 300 or 250 even.
Actually like 2 to probably 350 square feet, properly, like your actual proper
small.
Tiny home. And you know what? I have great respect for people that that's all they need,
right,
or all they want. But I'm not sure if that's for everybody, even on a reasonable, sustainable level. Like, not everybody can pull that off. I mean, if it's hard to,
and obviously if you have a family,
if you have a family, or I have three kids, 3 boys, and I mean, living in 600 square foot unit would be, I mean, people actually do that, so I know first world problems. I mean, let's be real here. I mean, there's lots of people, but at the same time, if you have the option, it's I can see why people don't necessarily go that route, but again,
increases
there's a very
the challenge.
reasonable middle ground that can be achieved. At the same, I also say that I don't need, even with 3 children, I don't need a 4,000 square foot house. I mean, they just don't, or not even close to that. I mean, you can get by just fine on 1,500 or a couple thousand, or there's no like objective. Well, this is just the right number for X number of people. But again, I think that the preferences and people realizing that they'll take what they need, not just, I want this, or I'm just gonna get as much as I can afford. Is that mentality is, fortunately, I think, for the most part, shifted away from that.
I'm glad to see that too. It's really encouraging to see that trend. We don't hear about things like tiny houses as crazy like we used to. We used to, I think, what was it, like even just 10 years ago, it was like all I ever heard about was, man, have you seen this documentary about this young couple that never built anything in their lives and they built a tiny house? There's some really cool documentaries you can watch about people who have never built anything, building their own tiny home. And it builds so mentally, that has got to be the coolest psychological thing. I mean, to build your own space with your own hands and all this stuff. My dad has done it. A lot of people have had this really cool success story, and it's. I would like to see where things like hempcrete and all these cool other renewable materials start to play into the idea of building our own little spaces, and I in conjunction with the village idea. I mean, all of this stuff really, not only does it build community in general, but I mean, the fact that it's giving us as a society this idea of self-satisfaction and really being able to take care of yourself in this minor convenience society we've created. What Carrie McGrath in our last episode of Artistic Expression, she called it the fast food convenience.
Right.
And seeing us get away from that, some companies might not like it, but I would argue that's what we have to do if we're going to see a sustainable world take place.
I agree with that convenience mindset. You prioritize everything over for the sake of that convenience, and you'll take it regardless of the cost, the environmental cost, or the I don't know, or the cost at our health or psychology or what have you. I mean, there's again a lot of things that go into that, but I agree that if that's the priority, that supersedes over everything else, then other more important things will suffer.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lovely conversation. I have been fascinated with this idea, and Brad and I have been trying to get together for like too long, trying to get together in the same building, and I'm so happy that we finally got together and talked about this. This was a really fun conversation. The first of many, I'm sure.
Enjoyed it,
as we kind of mentioned throughout the episode, as we tend to talk about in like all of our episodes now, we're like, well, let's not trail off into that tangent because there's a lot of other
leave it to me to do that for sure. So there's several other ideas just sitting in front of my brain right now that I could easily just start talking about. So it's fun stuff. A lot that goes into it.
So if you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask myself or Brad, just use the Sustainable Culture Podcast Gmail. It is sustainableculturepodcast@gmail.com. Please send those questions over. If you guys would like to support the show, remember we have a Patreon account now. It's just patreon.com/sustainableculturepodcast. And Brad, where can folks find you in Coeur Holdings if they have some questions or want to look into what you guys are doing?
Yeah, we have a site, coeurholdings.com and coeurvillage.com. My contact info is there, and we have some information on there, much of which is under development still and not on the site, but we're working hard at making the village project a reality, working with the city a lot, Department of Transportation. There's a lot going on that that are relevant to our project, the property, and therefore the project that we have to work through. That these things take time, but you can go there, and if you have any questions, reach out. I'd love to talk to anybody who is looking for info or has some ideas even. Any ideas you guys have? If you would like to have any questions be featured on social media or anything like that, any feedback whatsoever, in other words, send it on over. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening. And Brad, dude, thank you. Thank you, Josh.
For meeting up. This was so fun.
My pleasure.
Right on. See you guys.
Yet again, we've discovered a topic worth exploring with a sustainable outlook. And what's interesting to me, beyond the materials used and regulations followed, is the idea that solving these issues requires the adoption of a sustainable mindset long before development even occurs. We mentioned wonderful materials such as bamboo, cross-laminated wood, and hempcrete, but none of this happens without a psychological shift prior to the planning stages. We can move further and adapt to positive change if we simply decide to do so. Thanks again for listening to the show, everyone. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show and share us on social media with your friends and family. Remember, you can find us with a new episode every month on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you do your podcast listening. I'm Jet McLaughlin, and I'll see you next time.